The airplane hums softly. As it soared high above the clouds, the gentle vibrations of the plane seemed to lull the passengers into a quiet comfort. The flight attendants moved with practiced ease in the aisles, greeting passengers and offering drinks, their faces calm. Yet beneath their professionalism, something was of a subtle tension in the air that no one could quite place. At the back of the plane, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his eyes barely visible behind the sunglasses he wore, but there was something about him that drew the attention of anyone who glanced his way. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, but the way he carried himself made people wonder if he knew something they didn't, if he was the kind of person who'd spring into action at a moment's notice. Suddenly, a muffled sound echoed from the front of the plane, a soft thud followed by a voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. It was strange and unsettling, the kind of sound that made people stop mid-conversation and glance nervously towards the front of the cabin. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, their smiles faltering, as the man sitting near the front row stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, almost too calculated. The passengers around him shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing that something wasn't right, but no one dared say a word. The man was dressed in a dark jacket, his face mostly concealed by a pair of large sunglasses that seemed to reflect the overhead lights. His body language was rigid, tense, like a predator on the hunt. He didn't look like a typical passenger. No one had noticed him boarding the plane. No one had seen anything unusual until now. The flight attendants knew this was the moment they had been trained for, but even the best training couldn't prepare them for what was coming next. As the man's hand moved slowly inside his jacket and the crew members exchanged silent looks, it became clear to them that this wasn't just an irate passenger or a drunken fool. This was something far worse. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The air thickened with a sense of dread as the man's voice broke the silence, cold and demanding. He spoke in a low voice, but his words were sharp, like a knife cutting through the tension. He told them to change course immediately, and that no one would get hurt if they obeyed. The crew froze in place, their minds racing to process the situation. The lead flight attendant's hands shook as she subtly reached for the intercom button, her voice calm, but wavering as she spoke to the captain. Though her mind screamed at her to take action, she knew that one wrong move could turn this into something far more dangerous. From his seat at the back, Keanu watched the scene unfold with a stillness that made him appear detached from the chaos happening in front of him. But his eyes were sharp and calculating. Every movement of the man was being observed. Every word was being absorbed. He stood up slowly, as if nothing unusual had happened, and made his way down the aisle. His steps were deliberate, soft, but with purpose, and the few passengers who noticed him couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Was he just another concerned passenger, or was there something more to him than met the eye? The flight attendants moved into action, trying to follow protocol, but their hands were trembling, and their voices lacked the usual confidence. This wasn't just another routine emergency. This was real, and the fear in the air was palpable. The passengers began to whisper among themselves, their voices barely audible, but full of uncertainty. Keanu continued his quiet advance, moving unnoticed towards the front of the plane. As the hijacker's back was turned, he didn't make eye contact with anyone, not yet. His mind worked, quickly calculating the risks, weighing the consequences. He knew this was the moment where lives would be changed forever, and he was ready to step in if needed. The seconds felt like hours as the tension in the cabin grew thick. Every creak of the airplane, every footstep, was amplified in the eerie silence. The flight attendants tried to keep calm to control the situation, but the hijacker's demands were growing more erratic, more dangerous, and they realized that they were running out of time. The flight attendants had moved into action, but the reality of the situation was sinking in like cold water, soaking through their shoes. Their practiced calm was beginning to crack under the pressure. The man at the front was no longer just a threat. He was in immediate danger. His voice was steady, but there was a cold edge to it that sent chills down their spines. The passengers sat in uncomfortable silence, eyes darting from one another. Some whispered in hushed tones, while others sat frozen with fear. The hum of the engines now felt distant, as if the world outside had faded away, and all that remained was the tense air inside the cabin. The masked man paced in the aisle, his footsteps slow, deliberate, each one carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone around him, his hand never leaving the inside of his jacket, as if reassuring himself of the weapon hidden there. His eyes constantly scanned the room, but he didn't seem to notice the quiet tension in the back of the plane, where Keanu stood watching everything unfold. Keanu hadn't moved his gaze, never leaving the man at the front of the cabin. He wasn't just watching, he was calculating each step. The hijacker made each shift in the atmosphere. The room had become a powder keg, and he could feel it. Every nerve in his body told him that something had to be done soon, or this would end in disaster. His fingers twitched slightly as he stood near the back of the plane, the other passengers oblivious to his movements. His mind worked, quickly assessing the situation, wondering if he should make his move now or wait for the perfect moment. But something told him waiting would only make things worse. At the front of the plane, the flight attendant had reached the intercom and whispered a command to the captain. Though her voice trembled, the urgency was clear. She didn't know what to do next. The hijacker was growing more agitated as he paced back and forth, demanding answers no one could give him. Keanu's instincts were sharper now. The flight attendant had tried to reach the captain, but it was obvious from her shaking hands that she didn't have a solid plan in place. They were out of their depth. The hijacker had taken control of the plane, and they were simply waiting for him to make his next move. But Keanu wasn't waiting, he was preparing as much as he could. In the moments he took a step forward, his movements so subtle that no one noticed, not even the flight attendants, who were too focused on the hijacker. The time was ticking away, and every passing second felt like a countdown. The hijacker's demands became more frantic now. He started shouting at the crew, his voice cracking with rage. The passengers were starting to panic. Some had begun crying, others were clutching their armrests, white-knuckled, and staring straight ahead, as if willing themselves not to look at the man who controlled their fate. Keanu glanced over his shoulder just for a moment, his eyes locking with the flight attendant at the back of the plane. She seemed confused, almost pleading with her eyes, as if asking him to do something, anything, but Keanu didn't respond, not yet. He knew what he had to do, and it had to be done carefully. If he moved too soon, it could escalate the situation into something far worse. The hijacker was unpredictable, and Keanu knew from experience that you never gave a dangerous man any reason to feel cornered. The plane seemed to drop several feet suddenly. The turbulence jolted everyone forward, causing a few people to gasp and grab onto the nearest seat arms, instinctively clutching onto safety. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, the man at the front stopped pacing for a moment, his eyes darting to the crew. This was the moment Keanu had been waiting for. The hijacker had just turned his back to the aisle, his focus momentarily shifting away from the passengers. The seconds felt like years as Keanu's body tensed, ready to move, but he held back just a little longer. The flight attendants tried to stay calm, but their words were lost in the growing noise. The plane itself seemed to groan under the pressure. The hijacker's eyes shifted back and forth as he muttered to himself, angry and impatient. Keanu knew he didn't have much time. The moment for action was closing in, and when it came he had to be ready. The air in the cabin grew heavier with every passing second. The flight attendants moved in near silence, their eyes flicking from the hijacker to each other, their minds racing. They had no clear plan, no clear way to stop this man from getting what he wanted, but deep down they knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated further. The hijacker was growing impatient with every passing moment. His demands were becoming more erratic, his voice sharper, each word dripping with anger as he shouted at the crew. And the passengers, he was holding them all hostage without a single shot fired. and yet the fear was palpable in the air. Keanu's eyes were sharp, his every movement measured. He knew this wasn't the time to act just yet, but he could feel the pressure mounting, and it was becoming harder to stay still with each passing moment. The man at the front of the cabin was no longer just threatening them with his words. He was feeding off the fear around him. The atmosphere itself seemed to bend to his will. Keanu's thoughts raced back to his past roles, to the dangerous situations he had been in countless times. The instincts that had been honed over years of acting as a hero were now kicking in. The difference this time was that this wasn't a movie, this was real, and the stakes were higher than anything he had faced before. As the hijacker ranted and paced the aisle, Keanu took another step forward, his eyes scanning the room, watching the reactions of the passengers, each of their faces etched with fear, their bodies stiff and rigid, none of them knowing how to handle the situation. Not even the flight attendants seemed prepared for this kind of chaos. A woman near the window broke into sobs, clutching her handbag to her chest, as if it could protect her from the madness unfolding around her. Others tried to console her, but their voices trembled with fear, their words barely audible over the hijacker's shouts. Keanu's gaze flickered back to the hijacker, and he saw it then, a slight shift in his posture, a moment of distraction. The man had briefly turned his attention to a nearby passenger, his gaze momentarily lingering on a person in the front row who had become too vocal in their panic. The hijacker's eyes narrowed, and Keanu could feel the tension in the air shift. He had been waiting for this moment. The hijacker was vulnerable just for an instant, and it was in that brief second that Keanu made his move. He stepped lightly but swiftly down the aisle, his body sliding into position behind the man as if he had been a shadow all along. The movement was so subtle, no one seemed to notice at first. The flight attendants were too focused on the hijacker to realize that Keanu had taken his first step towards stopping the madness. The hijacker was still distracted by the outburst from the panicked passenger, but that wouldn't last long. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest, but his body remained steady. His hand brushed against the cold metal of the seat in front of him, his fingers lightly gripping the armrest to steady himself. The feeling of the moment had arrived, his body now in sync with his thoughts. Everything around him seemed to slow down as he prepared for what was coming next. But then the hijacker turned suddenly, his eyes locking onto Keanu for the first time, their gazes clashing in a silent standoff. In that instant, the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. The hijacker's gaze was cold and calculating, his hand still clenched around the weapon in his jacket. But Keanu didn't flinch, he didn't move, he simply stared back with a quiet resolve. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, neither of them blinked. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, the sound of the airplane's engines barely cutting through the tension that hung between Keanu and the hijacker. The entire plane seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the hijacker sneered, a thin smile spreading across his face, as if he were daring Keanu to make a move. But Keanu didn't rise to the challenge. Not yet. He knew that one wrong move could set everything off, and he wasn't going to make that mistake. Instead, he held his ground, every muscle in his body taut, as a bowstring poised ready to strike, but waiting for the perfect moment to act. The man at the front of the plane was clearly trying to intimidate him, trying to make him second-guess himself. But Keanu wasn't interested in playing games. He was waiting for the hijacker to make the next mistake. The seconds stretched on longer than anyone could bear. The entire plane seemed to be caught in this suspended moment, where the outcome was uncertain, where every breath felt like it could be the last. The hijacker was still sizing him up, clearly unsure of what Keanu would do next, and that was exactly what Keanu had been hoping for. The silence between Keanu and the hijacker felt suffocating. Every passenger seemed to hold their breath, not daring to make a sound. The only noise that filled the air was the steady hum of the airplane engines and the soft rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats, trying to stay out of sight, trying to remain as invisible as possible. Keanu's eyes never left the hijacker's cold stare, his body tense and ready to spring into action at any moment. But he knew better than to make the first move. Not yet. The hijacker was a loose cannon, unpredictable, and every step Keanu took would need to be calculated with precision. The hijacker's hand clenched tighter around the weapon inside his jacket, his fingers twitching slightly as if testing the weight of it. Feeling the power that was still within his control, he knew that he had the upper hand for now, but the question was, how long could he hold on to it? Keanu could sense the hijacker's unease, the way his gaze flickered toward the passengers, his eyes scanning their terrified faces, before returning to Keanu, his lip curling into a sneer. It was almost as if the hijacker was waiting for someone to make a mistake. But Keanu wasn't that person. He wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Across the aisle, the flight attendants were still in motion, but their movements were hesitant, their voices shaky as they tried to reassure the passengers. Without showing how terrified they truly were, they were trained for emergencies. But nothing in their training had prepared them for a situation like this. Nothing had prepared them for a man with a weapon on a plane hundreds of miles in the sky. As the hijacker paced again, Keanu's mind raced through possible scenarios. How long could he afford to wait before taking action? The man at the front was beginning to grow impatient again, his footsteps louder, now his every movement more erratic, as if he could feel the control slipping from his hands. The tension was building, and Keanu knew something had to give. The hijacker spun around suddenly, his eyes wild with fury, as he screamed at the crew, his voice echoing off the walls of the cabin. But it wasn't just his voice. It was the fear in his voice, the desperation that rang through each word, that gave Keanu the clarity he needed. He was losing control. He was unraveling. Keanu's eyes narrowed, and his fingers curled into fists for a split second. He felt something stir within him, the same feeling he'd had in the past when faced with danger, the overwhelming sense of duty to protect, to do whatever it took to stop this madness before it went any further. He glanced down the aisle, his eyes catching the flight attendants. For just a moment, their expressions pleading, as if silently asking for help. But Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. They were already doing everything they could. All he had to do now was figure out how to end this before it escalated even further. The hijacker was still shouting, pacing back and forth, his focus so laser-like on the crew that he didn't notice Keanu take a step forward, his footfall so quiet that only Keanu himself could hear it, his body sliding into position like a predator preparing to strike, his eyes now locked on the hijacker's every movement. The hijacker's voice grew louder and more frantic, but in the midst of his ranting, he turned his back once again. The opportunity was there, and Keanu moved like lightning, his hand darting forward in one swift motion, grabbing the man's wrist. Before he could even react, the hijacker let out a startled gasp. But it was too late. Keanu was already in control. In a flash, Keanu twisted the hijacker's arm behind his back, forcing him down onto the floor with an almost effortless motion. The hijacker gasped in pain, struggling to free himself. But Keanu's grip was like iron, unyielding and precise. The weapon he had been holding so confidently was now discarded on the floor, out of reach. The passengers' eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. They had been frozen in fear, unsure of what would happen next, unsure if they were about to witness a tragedy unfold before their very eyes. But now they watched as the hijacker was subdued, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried and failed to fight back. The flight attendants were still reeling from the shock of the sudden turn of events, but now they rushed forward quickly to help Keanu secure the hijacker, his body still trembling, but with relief in their eyes as they realized the danger was no longer as imminent as it had been moments before. Keanu stood over the subdued man, his body relaxed, but his eyes sharp, scanning the cabin for any other threats, his hands still steady. Even as the adrenaline coursed through him, he knew that it wasn't over yet. They still had to land the plane and make sure this man was handed over to the authorities. But for now the immediate danger had passed. The hijacker lay on the floor staring up at Keanu, his expression a mixture of shock and fury, his mind clearly racing as he realized that he had lost control, that his plan had failed, but Keanu's face remained impassive. His job was done for now. The passengers were safe, but the journey was far from over. The plane was still now, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the uneasy silence that hung over the cabin. Keanu stood over the subdued hijacker, his hand still gripping the man's wrist as the flight attendants moved quickly to secure him. One of them carefully reached for the discarded weapon and held it at arm's length, as if afraid it might still be dangerous. The passengers were still frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief, as they slowly began to process what had just happened. Some of them were whispering to one another in hushed voices, their words filled with fear, and all others sat with their hands clenched tightly to the armrests, their bodies rigid, as they tried to come to terms with the chaos that had unfolded right in front of them. Keanu didn't move. He simply watched the hijacker carefully, his eyes sharp, his body alert. Even now, his senses on high alert. He could feel the tension still lingering in the air. The danger wasn't completely over, not yet, not while they were still miles from the ground. And no one knew how far this man's plan had gone. The hijacker lay on the floor, his face contorted in frustration and anger, his breathing heavy and erratic. He still struggled against Keanu's grip, but it was no use. The fight had been taken out of him, for now his body was pinned to the floor, and there was nowhere for him to go. Keanu's expression remained unchanged as he surveyed the scene. He could hear the flight attendants speaking in low voices as they coordinated with the captain, trying to figure out what to do next. But Keanu wasn't listening to them. His attention was still focused on the hijacker, who was slowly beginning to calm down. The man's eyes flickered toward Keanu, his gaze filled with hatred, but also something else, something deeper, a flicker of fear, something that Keanu didn't miss. His mind worked, quickly calculating the man's next move, wondering if this was just the beginning of something more dangerous, or if the worst had already passed. As the seconds ticked by, Keanu could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. They were watching him closely, waiting for him to do something, to take charge. Even though he had already done what needed to be done, they were still looking for reassurance. They still needed someone to lead them through this storm. The flight attendants finally moved in, carefully restraining the hijacker's arms and securing him in a seat with the help of a few nearby passengers who had regained their composure enough to assist. Their hands were shaking, but they did their best to keep the man subdued and under control. Keanu didn't relax, not yet, his mind still racing as he observed the cabin, the other passengers, their nervous faces, their fearful eyes. He knew that there was still more to be done. They weren't out of danger, yet there were still many questions that needed answering, and the flight wasn't over until the plane was safely on the ground. The flight attendants moved toward the cockpit now, coordinating with the captain, who was still communicating with air traffic control, trying to make sure everything was in order. But Keanu didn't follow them. He stayed where he was, eyes scanning the cabin once more, his senses heightened as he watched every move the hijacker made. The plane jolted suddenly as it hit a patch of turbulence. The passengers gasped and gripped the armrests tightly, some of them muttering prayers under their breath, while others squeezed their eyes shut, as if trying to block out the reality of what was happening. The turbulence felt like a reminder that they were still far from safe, still in the sky, with no guarantee of a smooth landing. Keanu's grip tightened for a moment as he steadied himself, his eyes never leaving the hijacker, who was now slumped in his seat, his body still, but his mind clearly racing. He could feel the weight of the man's anger and frustration simmering just below the surface. A few moments later, the flight attendants returned to the main cabin, their faces pale but determined, as they made their way down the aisle toward Keanu. One of them whispered to him urgently, her voice low, but filled with urgency. The captain wanted to speak to him, she said, and Keanu nodded without hesitation, his eyes never leaving the hijacker's face. The flight attendant stepped aside to make room for him. As Keanu moved toward the cockpit, his mind still focused on the mission ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this hijacker than he had originally realized, something more dangerous, something far more sinister that hadn't yet revealed itself. As Keanu approached the cockpit door, he felt the eyes of every passenger on him, their hope now resting on his shoulders, as if he was the only one who could get them out of this alive. The weight of their gazes was heavy, but Keanu didn't falter. He stepped through the door without hesitation and into the cockpit. Inside, the captain looked up, his face tense, but grateful to see Keanu. The conversation was brief. The plan was to land as soon as possible and alert the authorities, but Keanu knew that wasn't enough. They still needed to ensure that the hijacker didn't have any more surprises in store for them before they reached the ground. Keanu's mind raced as the plane continued to fly through the turbulent skies. The real danger wasn't over yet, not while they were still in the air, and not while the hijacker was still breathing. The cockpit door clicked shut behind Keanu, his eyes briefly meeting the captain's before both of them turned their attention back to the situation at hand. The captain's face was lined with stress, but his posture was still professional, his hands steady on the controls as the plane continued its flight through the turbulent skies. Keanu's mind was racing. He could hear the faint whispers of the flight attendants as they continued securing the passengers and keeping the hijacker under control, but his thoughts were elsewhere, his instincts telling him there was more to this situation than met the eye. He knew the hijacker hadn't acted alone. There had to be someone else behind this, and that realization gnawed at the back of his mind like a persistent itch. He looked toward the captain, who was still focused on the flight path, Keanu's eyes narrowing as he thought about their next steps. They had to land soon, but Keanu knew that wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. The hijacker had already proven how unpredictable he was, and that left too many unanswered questions. As the turbulence rattled the plane, the captain spoke, his voice low but clear. "Keanu, we're going to need you to stay in the cabin and make sure the passengers remain calm. If the hijacker has any accomplices, it could get worse before we land." Keanu nodded, his eyes already scanning the screens in front of the captain, monitoring their position as they flew over the darkened clouds beneath them. The feeling of being trapped in the sky began to settle in again. They were at the mercy of this man's unpredictability, and Keanu knew that it was only a matter of time before things took another turn for the worse. Outside the cockpit, the cabin was still tense. The flight attendants did their best to reassure the passengers, but there was only so much comfort they could offer when the fear was so palpable, so raw. The hijacker was subdued, but Keanu could still feel his anger simmering just below the surface. The man wasn't defeated, not yet. The flight attendants were beginning to get more organized, now moving up and down the aisles, taking stock of everyone's safety. But Keanu could tell they were just as nervous as the passengers. Their professionalism was only skin deep. The moment they had been thrust into was beyond any training they had ever received. He left the cockpit without another word, his mind still spinning as he returned to the main cabin, where the hijacker was now sitting quietly, his head down, as if waiting for something. The passengers watched him closely, their eyes wary, their bodies tense, but they didn't dare make a sound. Keanu moved through the aisle, slowly taking his time, his eyes never leaving the hijacker's form, who still seemed to be brooding in silence. He was just as dangerous now as he had been when he first stepped onto the plane, but Keanu knew the key was to keep him contained until they could land. He wasn't going to let his guard down. The hijacker's eyes flicked up to meet Keanu's as he passed, and for a moment there was a flash of something in those eyes, fear, or perhaps calculation. Keanu wasn't sure, but he wasn't going to let the man get inside his head, not now, not when they were so close to ending this nightmare. The turbulence hit again, this time more violently. The plane shuddered as it dropped several feet, causing the passengers to gasp and clutch their armrests tightly. Some screamed, but most remained silent, eyes wide with terror, as they tried to stay calm as the chaos outside seemed to mirror the chaos inside. Keanu steadied himself, grabbing onto the nearest seat back as the plane rocked and pitched. The hijacker remained motionless, his eyes scanning the cabin like a predator sensing the moment of weakness. Before Keanu's own senses snapped into action, he knew the hijacker was waiting for the plane to destabilize again, to catch someone off guard, but Keanu wouldn't give him that opportunity. As the plane leveled off, the flight attendants moved with quiet urgency, taking a head count of the passengers, making sure everyone was accounted for. But Keanu knew they were worried too. They could feel the tension in the air, just as strongly as he did. They were all just waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the next unpredictable move from the man who had caused this terror. The hijacker's breathing was heavy now. He had finally raised his head and locked eyes with Keanu once more. The anger in his gaze was unmistakable, but Keanu could see the fear creeping in. The hijacker was no longer in control. He was starting to realize that this was slipping from his grasp, and that realization was the last thing he wanted. Keanu's mind was still processing the unfolding situation when a sudden thought hit him like a lightning bolt. Could there be more hijackers? Were they not alone? Was there someone else on the plane, someone else who hadn't shown their hand yet? His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of a threat that was still lurking in the shadows. His hand tightened around the back of a chair as he moved slowly through the aisles, scanning the passengers. One by one, there was no way he was going to let his guard down, not until this was truly over. Keanu moved through the cabin like a shadow, his mind working quickly, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. There was a strange sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The hijacker had been subdued, but the feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface grew stronger with each passing minute. The crew was calm, but Keanu could see the cracks in their composure. The passengers were terrified, their fear hanging in the air like a thick fog, and all he could do was keep moving, keep watching. The turbulence had settled, but the unease inside the cabin was far from gone. Keanu's eyes scanned every face, every movement. In the seats, he had learned long ago that the slightest detail could mean the difference between life and death in situations like this. And right now, nothing seemed right. The hijacker was too quiet, his eyes too calculating, as if he was waiting for something, a signal, maybe, or a moment of weakness. Keanu's heart beat steady, his thoughts focused, but his senses were screaming at him something was off. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down, not now, not when they were so close to landing, so close to safety. But he also knew he couldn't be the only one thinking this way. He had to trust the crew to stay alert too. But when he glanced over at the flight attendants, he could see their tension written in their faces. They were trying to keep their composure, but it was getting harder to hide their fear. The hijacker shifted in his seat, suddenly his eyes flicking toward Keanu, his gaze narrowing, as if trying to gauge his next move. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't let the man see any sign of weakness. But inside his mind, the alarm bells were ringing louder than ever. Something was happening, something he couldn't see yet. The flight attendants continued to move down the aisles, quietly checking on the passengers, making sure everyone was still calm. But Keanu noticed one of them pausing by a seat, just a few rows ahead of him, her eyes darting nervously back and forth, as if searching for something. She looked down at the floor, as if something had caught her attention. Keanu's gaze followed hers, and his blood ran cold. There was a small metallic object lying on the floor, a device hidden under the seat. It was too small to be easily noticed, but Keanu recognized it instantly. It was a detonator. He didn't know how he knew, but he could feel it in his gut. The hijacker had planted something on the plane, and it was ready to go off at any moment. The blood drained from Keanu's face as he locked eyes with the flight attendant. She looked just as shocked as he felt, but there was no time to waste. Keanu took a step forward, motioning for her to stay calm, and he whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "We have to move, we have to disarm it now." She nodded quickly, and the two of them moved toward the device, as if everything was moving in slow motion. Keanu's mind raced through every possibility, every scenario he had ever been trained for. But this was different. This wasn't a bomb planted in some foreign land. This was in the air. This was their lives on the line, and every second that passed brought them closer to disaster. Keanu reached the device, first his hands shaking, but his movements steady. As he crouched down to examine it, his heart pounded in his chest. But he didn't let it show the hijacker was still watching him. But his attention was divided. He had no idea that Keanu had found the detonator, and that was exactly what Keanu was counting on. The flight attendant stood behind him, her eyes wide with fear, but she trusted him. She knew that Keanu was the only one who could keep them all alive. She was still unsure of how to help, but Keanu didn't need her to do anything except stay out of sight, stay alert. If this went wrong, she needed to be ready to act. Keanu's fingers brushed against the detonator as he carefully moved it from under the seat and placed it on the floor of the aisle. The device was small, but the tension around it was palpable. He could feel the weight of every moment as he adjusted his grip on the device, his mind still racing through what needed to be done. He could hear the hijacker shifting again in his seat, his gaze locking onto Keanu with a renewed intensity, his eyes gleaming with a mix of anger and disbelief. But Keanu didn't look back at him. His focus was entirely on the detonator. He had to disarm it now before it was too late. He took a deep breath, his hands steadying as he began to work the delicate wires inside the detonator, his movements slow and calculated, every second feeling like an eternity. The hum of the plane's engines was deafening now as he worked against time. Just as his fingers brushed against the final wire, he heard the hijacker's voice suddenly rise in a shout, and Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He knew it was coming, he could feel it, but there was no turning back now. The hijacker's voice rang out loud and desperate, echoing through the cabin. As Keanu's fingers danced across the detonator, his heartbeat drummed in his ears louder than the plane's engines, the pressure mounting with each passing second. Keanu knew that he was moments away from making a choice that could mean life or death for everyone on board, but he couldn't let the panic take over. He had to stay focused, stay calm. The hijacker's voice was shaking now, a mixture of rage and fear, his eyes fixed on Keanu, as if he knew something was happening, but couldn't quite place what. The confusion in his gaze was a glimmer of hope for Keanu, because it meant that he wasn't aware that the detonator was already in his grasp. His momentary distraction was all Keanu needed. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. The passengers were almost frozen, their fear palpable, their eyes wide with terror, as they watched the exchange between Keanu and the hijacker. The flight attendants stood by, ready to act, but unsure of what to do next, their hands twitching as they waited for the slightest command from Keanu. Keanu's breath was steady as he pulled back a small cover, revealing the wires inside the detonator. He could feel the weight of every passenger's hope resting on him. He was the only one who could stop this, the only one who could save them all. And as much as he wanted to rush through it, he knew that every movement had to be deliberate, or it could all go wrong. The hijacker's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his seat, as he slowly began to stand up, his feet shifting on the floor. The panic was taking over now. Keanu could see the man's mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to understand how it all slipped out of his control. But it was too late. The plane wasn't his anymore. It was Keanu's domain now, and Keanu wasn't going to let it end in disaster. The flight attendant behind Keanu moved closer, her hands trembling as she watched Keanu's every move. She wanted to help, but Keanu had given her no instructions. She could only stand and watch as Keanu carefully untangled the wires, his hands working with precision, the seconds feeling like hours as he held his breath and focused on the task at hand. The hijacker took a few more steps forward, his feet heavy, as if he were walking through molasses, his face contorted with frustration, his eyes wild with a mix of desperation and confusion. Keanu could feel the man's gaze on him, like a pressure on his back, But he didn't look up, he didn't let the hijacker see how much the pressure was mounting on him, because if Keanu showed even a hint of doubt, it would give the hijacker what he was looking for, a crack in his resolve. With one swift motion, Keanu cut through the final wire. He felt the slight release of tension as the circuit inside the detonator, powered down the small device, clicked. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The plane was eerily quiet, except for the soft hum of the engines. The passengers remained frozen, in fear, unsure of what had just happened, unsure if they were truly safe. Keanu stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he let the detonator drop to the floor, the weight of what he had just done settling in his chest. He had done it, he had disarmed the device. But that didn't mean they were out of danger, not yet. The hijacker let out a growl of frustration as his eyes flicked from Keanu to the detonator on the floor, the realization dawning on him that he had lost the upper hand. Keanu could see the shift in the man's demeanor. He was no longer just an angry hijacker. He was now a man cornered, a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. Keanu's eyes never left the hijacker as the flight attendants moved in quickly to subdue him again. Their hands were firm now, their movements more confident. The tide had turned, and the hijacker's chances of winning had evaporated. Keanu had taken control of the situation, and now the flight attendants were taking care of the rest. The hijacker was no longer a threat, but Keanu knew that they still had a long way to go. The plane wasn't safe until they had landed, and this man's accomplices, if they existed, were still out there. They could still be a danger, lurking in the shadows. The flight attendants quickly moved the hijacker into an empty seat and secured him once again, their eyes still wide with the same fear that had been there since the beginning. But now they had something else in their eyes, something. Keanu recognized it, was relief. The flight attendants were still shaken, but they were no longer afraid of the immediate danger. They were still in the air, but they could breathe again. Keanu looked at the captain through the small window of the cockpit door. He could see the captain's face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard. The captain nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement that they were still in this together. But Keanu knew the captain was just as wary as he was. The danger wasn't over. They still had to land and make sure the plane and everyone on it were safe. Keanu turned back to the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers, who were now slowly beginning to exhale, their bodies loosening as the immediate threat faded, their tension still present. But the fear now replaced with cautious hope. Keanu had done what needed to be done, but the fight wasn't over yet.